Next, we will get into a little more detail about what the regional center intake process looks like specifically for our Early Start population. Early Start is the regional center program that supports very young children from 0 until their 3rd birthday. And we're pleased to have with us today LaWanna Blair from Harbor Regional Center to provide details about what you as a family can expect during the Regional Center Early Start intake process. LaWanna?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Amy stated, I'm going to provide a brief overview of the Early Start intake process. And I want to start by acknowledging that as it's been stated, we know that this process is very overwhelming for families, and it produces many different emotions. And so because of this, we really try to take our time with making sure that we're explaining the process to parents, and that we are compassionate and understanding that this is an overwhelming process. And we want to make sure that families feel comfortable, that they feel heard and supported. And one of our primary goals is to ensure that families have a positive and seamless experience, and that their interactions with the intake staff sets the tone for what they can expect as they navigate through the rest of their journey with the regional center. So the information that I'm going to share in the next few slides is guided by IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this is the law that governs how state and public agencies provide early intervention and special education services to eligible infants and toddlers with disabilities. So Part C of IDEA is specific to children from birth to 3. So starting off with the referrals, the regional center receives referrals when there are concerns regarding a developmental delay. And so primarily the referrals will come in from parents, and most of the time the parents may not understand what's happening, and their pediatrician may be providing some information about resources. And so parents will reach out to the regional center to start that process. But referrals can also come from daycare centers, teachers, and if the child is connected or involved with Department of Children and Family Services, a social worker can also make a referral to the regional center if they have concerns regarding a disability. Referrals can also come in different sources. So we take referrals via phone. Mail-in applications are also accepted, and then many regional centers have online systems that will allow the applications to be uploaded. Again, each regional center have their own different intake protocols, and so this would look different according to which regional center you're working with. But before we can get started with the intake process, we have to have an assessment or assigned consent, to from the parent in order for us to initiate those assessments that need to take place. We need to make sure that we have appropriate and accurate contact information of the parent or guardian, because this is how we are going to communicate with you during the process. And then also any documents that a family may have to support their concerns would be helpful, although this is not necessary. Next slide. So as far as the eligibility process, eligibility has to be determined within 45 days from the date of the referral. And so this process involves a multidisciplinary team, which includes the parent, a regional center, and a professional. So the child will go through an evaluation with a licensed therapist, and this could be an occupational therapist, a physical therapist, or a speech and language pathologist. And so every effort is made to schedule an assessment with a therapist based on the concerns that the family has identified. For example, if the child has concerns primarily with speech, then every effort is going to be made to schedule the assessments with a speech pathologist. Regardless of the discipline, each therapist will be focusing on 5 different developmental areas, and these are the areas that you can see on the slide. So what we're looking at is cognitive delays, delays with adaptive skills, communication, social, emotional, and in physical and motor delays. So once the assessment has been completed, the multidisciplinary team reviews the information, and that team again includes the parent, and they will determine if the child is eligible for regional center services under the Early Start program. So there are 3 different categories that will determine eligibility, and the first one is established risk. And so this is for children who have a condition of known etiology and where they have a high probability of resulting in a developmental delay. So this is going to be those children that have been diagnosed with Down syndrome. They may have genetic disorders or neurological disease. The second category is high risk, and these are children must be considered at high risk of having a developmental delay when they are premature. So basically less than 32 weeks of gestation. And then if a parent, if their parent is also a regional center client, that the child would also be considered high risk. And the final category is developmental delay. And these are children who will demonstrate a 33% or more delay in one of the areas identified on the screen above as far as the cognitive adaptive skills. So any delay in any one of those areas, any 33% delay in any one of those areas could also qualify a child for services under the Early Start program. Next slide. So after the assessment, the multidisciplinary team determines eligibility based on one of the 3 categories described in the previous slide. But if a child is not eligible, information will be provided to the family about how they can access those supports through other community-based resources, including their private insurance. The family will also be provided with appeal rights because they may disagree with our eligibility decision. And at that point, they would have the right to go through the appeals process. If the child is determined eligible, they would receive, in both cases, they will receive an ineligible letter or an eligible letter. And then the case will get assigned to a service coordinator, and this person will be the primary contact at the regional center. So the service coordinator would then call the family to schedule what's called the individual family services plan. And that plan is a written agreement between the family and the regional center that details how early intervention services will be provided to the child and the family. The plan should also include documentation of different resources for the family's priorities, their concerns. It should also talk about or document information regarding evaluations and assessments, the child and family outcomes, and then also details about what specific services are being provided, who's providing those services, and the duration and frequency in which the services will be provided. The meeting can be held in the family's home, at the regional center, or any other place in the community. And I know that, you know, in the last 2.5 years, it's been a little different because of the pandemic. But those are just some options in which regional centers have flexibility in where we can have that meeting. The meeting is a collaborative approach to understand the needs of the child and the family. And then the information that is gathered will be used to establish outcomes for the child and for the individuals, keeping in mind that we're also keeping the family in mind as well. So the IFSP team consists of the parent, the service coordinator, the provider if appropriate, and anyone else that the parent chooses to be a part of the meeting. The frequency of the IFSP meetings, they occur every 6 months following the initial meeting. But there are essentially 4 types of IFSP meetings. And the first one being the initial. And that initial meeting is going to take place after eligibility has been determined. And then 6 months from that meeting, you would have a periodic meeting. And this is really to review the progress that the child has made, really to look at the outcomes that were established in that initial IFSP. Is the child on target? Are they meeting their goals? Are there any modifications that need to be made? So this is really just a review of, what's happening with the child, and it allows us to determine, what additional support the family may need, the child and the family may need. And then 6 months from that, we're back at the annual now. And so you would have an annual IFSP, and the process is really the same. But again, we're just starting over and looking at what are the next set of goals that we want to work on with this child and the family. And then the fourth type of meeting is the transition IFSP meeting. And this happens 90 days prior to the child's third birthday. And I'll talk about this later in one of the later slides. But just in general, what families need to understand is that at any time, they can request for an addendum IFSP meeting to discuss new concerns or new requests for additional supports. They can always call their service coordinator to reconvene an IFS meeting to discuss whatever they choose to discuss. The service coordinator's responsibility. So as I stated, the service coordinator is the primary contact for the family, and they can provide the family with support in many different ways. But essentially, their job is to facilitate the IFSP meetings, to provide the family with support, information and choices and resources, to coordinate services and evaluations, to also be responsive to the family's needs in a timely manner, and then also to monitor the delivery of services. So as I stated before, the regional center will, we provide specific services to address the child's needs. And we want to not just put a service in place and walk away and come back in 6 months. We want to check in to see, how are those services going? Is the family seeing any progress? Are there concerns with the providers? Is there anything that needs to be changed? And so that is the service coordinator's responsibility, is to stay connected, stay in communication with the families to make sure that, again, we are their support, and that, if they need something from us, that we're being responsive to their needs. And then also we want to make sure that the family is advised of all of the procedural safeguards, and basically making sure that we are providing them with their rights and that they understand what their rights are. During this process, we do know too that it's a lot of information between the intake process and between the initial IFSP meeting. Families are given a lot of different information, and that can be overwhelming at times. And so families are not always going to remember what information is being told to them. So it's important for parents to understand that they can always call us back if they didn't understand something, or if they need to have another meeting. You need to have us re-explain, the process to you, because we try to provide information in increments that the family can digest, and they don't feel that so much is kind of thrown at them at one time. Next slide. So here are some of the primary services that are provided to children in the Early Start program. Now, while these services are available, not every child will need the same level of supports and services. And services will be provided based on individual needs. So evaluations and assessments that we talked about earlier in the process, we're going to use those to determine what's best for a particular or an individual child. Regional centers are the payer of last resort, which means that we have to consider other funding sources before we're able to purchase the service. But when we are initiating a service, our responsibility is to support the family in accessing that service through their insurance. We do understand that sometimes that's very difficult for families, and sometimes insurance companies take a long time to respond or to provide the family with the information that they need. Sometimes they have to go through the process of, the doctor submitting a referral. Like, we understand that there's certain steps that families are expected to take. And so we don't want the process to be prolonged. And the regional center in the interim will put a service in place while the family is navigating supports through their generic resource or through their private insurance. But what the family should also understand is that the regional center has a responsibility to put funding in place within 45 days from that initial IFSP meeting. Next slide. So as I mentioned a couple of slides back, the transition IFSP meeting happens 90 days before the child turns 3. So the family, the service coordinator, and the school district or the school staff will be a part of that transition meeting. So the purpose of that meeting is to plan for the child's exit out of the Early Start program and into special education program or some other community-based program. So there are potentially 3 meetings that can take place at the child's transition from Early Start. And one of the meetings would be the final IFSP. And this would be to review progress towards the Early Start goals that have been identified in the previous IFSP, and then also to provide the family with some closure. And this is important because oftentimes, you know, I've heard where families feel that when their kid turned 3, they don't understand why there was a change in the types of services that were provided, or how come they're not providing or receiving the service at the same frequency. And so this is a good opportunity for the service coordinator to, you know, really provide some clarity as to what that looks like. Second type of meeting is the IEP meeting, and this is to determine eligibility for special education services. And the third one would be the IPP meeting, which is the individual program plan. And that's to develop the written plan for what services and supports the child may be eligible for if they have been determined eligible for services under the Lanterman Act over the age of 3. If the child is eligible, the service coordinator, again, is responsible for ensuring a smooth transition from Early Start into the school system. There are multiple things that are being discussed at the meeting, including, as I indicated, the eligibility for special education services. They're going to talk about what kind of services the school will be able to provide. They're going to talk about an appropriate classroom placement. They're going to develop and discuss specific plans for transition. And also, you know, again, as I stated, discussing and preparing the parent and the child for what that looks like after the age of 3. If the child is not eligible, they're also going to be discussing appropriate preschool and Head Start programs or other community-based programs that the child can have access to. And then I already discussed about funding through the insurance. So sometimes if the service is ending with the regional center, their insurance is likely able to provide continuation of funding for those therapy services. And then the final step is the process for determining eligibility over the age of 3. And the next presenter will discuss these steps with you.